So we see an incredible process, a slice of history. Cinerama in 1952 combated television like no other film media format had before. Before 1952, before Cinerama came out, there was no stereo in popular use. There was no widescreen cinema in popular use. 70 millimeter had been invented and died. CinemaScope had been invented and died. 3D had been invented and died. People pretty much were watching the square pictures, all shaped like our TV sets, simply because Hollywood realized, I mean, the last major thing that Hollywood accepted as far as a change was the introduction of sound. They wouldn't even let stereo be used, even though Abel Gance, who used the triptych idea in Napoleon, also brought about the first use of stereo in the early 30s with 2 channels of sound. I was talking to a friend of ours who works at the Library of Congress. He dropped by to visit yesterday. He was telling us, thank you, he was telling us about a film that had recently been discovered from, I think he said it was like 1908, that was actually a color film. They didn't think it existed, but they found it. So all these things have been tried. 1952, this is Cinerama comes out and becomes the biggest moneymaker. They start customizing theaters and building cinemas to play it. And what happens the next year after Cinerama's introduced? The first one, I believe, the first innovation was that 3D came out within a year. Moana Devil started shaking people up because they used 2 projector 3D, which is really a high-quality third-dimension presentation, but you had to wear glasses. And during 1953, there were a lot of films made in 3D that were quite amazing. House of Wax, Charge of Feather River, Hondo, a bunch of other titles. A lot of them are lost forever simply because if people don't buy tickets to see it, the film isn't preserved. You can't count on AMC to do it, the Academies, or Museum of Modern Art. They're all trying to preserve as many films as they can, but they can't keep up with how many titles are sitting there unwanted, unloved, falling apart, collecting dust on shelves. Within 2 years after This Is Cinerama's come out, The Robe comes out in CinemaScope, How to Marry a Millionaire comes out in CinemaScope and in stereo. I'm not sure if it's 2 or 3 channels, but it still wasn't the 7 channels that Cinerama offers. Not long after that, one of the original founders of the company, you remember? Do you know what it is?
4 channels.
It was 4 channel for How to Marry a Millionaire? Was it magnetic?
3 front, 1 back, magnetic.
1 back, was that like for the side walls?
Yeah.
It's nice to have Scott here from Wide Gauge Cinema. Scott published a really interesting newsletter you can pick up in the lobby for free where he compares all the various formats of Cinerama. And everywhere down the line, you keep checking. There's nothing wider. There's nothing that used more channels of stereo. There's nothing that had sharper focus on screen. There's lots of imitations like IMAX, OmniMax, ShowScan, all these other processes, 3D. They're all copies, but they somehow miss the boat if they don't follow what Fred Waller discovered after 20 years of experimentation. Let's see, Michael Todd, who worked with the original Cinerama film, but ended up charging too much on his credit cards, I guess, jumped the company. He got a bad reputation as a promoter for overextending himself, borrowing a lot more money than he was making. So he left Cinerama and started a company of his own with American Optical called Todd AO. They went to Broadway. This is an idea that Cinerama had, but they never used. They went to Broadway, got a successful Rodgers and Hammerstein play, Oklahoma, filmed it beautifully in 70 millimeter film, but distributors had to go buy the special equipment to play it like it was intended to show. So it became very expensive, and this was something Hollywood fought all the time. They didn't have to buy new equipment. Think about it. What if 70 millimeter would have replaced all the film that had come before it? Suddenly theaters wouldn't, just like Cinerama, have the equipment to play 35 millimeter. They wouldn't have the equipment to play 3D. They would have all this just 70 millimeter equipment. All the films that had been made would be useless. All the films that were in distribution would be worthless. All the films that they were getting ready to make, they'd have to redo to do it in a different format. Well, 70 millimeter caught on for a long time. They made a lot of incredible films around the world in 80 days. Sound of Music, West Side Story, South Pacific, all in 70 millimeter. Beautiful films, 16 times sharper focus than a regular film. But it still didn't approach what Cinerama could do with 25 times sharper focus. So we love It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. But boy, wouldn't it look great if it was shown in 3 projector Cinerama. Cinerama struggled for such a long time that when the 70s came along, they were willing to do anything to make money, to cover their expenses. They went from being a very successful company when they were actually making 3 projector films to getting the accountants kind of taking over and cutting the legs out from underneath them. That in the early 70s, they released a compilation film. It was called the best of Cinerama, and I hate this when I run into somebody who's seen the best of Cinerama and they've never seen anything else, because what they did was they made flat copies and showed them on a flat screen. So the whole point of the curved screen, 3D effect, extra bright image, extra rich stereo is all gone. This became, it's kind of like taking a color photograph and making a black and white copy. It didn't work. Or like Ted Turner would do, make a black and white film and colorize it, try to get young people to watch it. Well, it's good that they watch them, but you really should see them in black and white the way they're intended to be shown. Well, Cinerama, this was the last. They turned belly up from this point on. They hit bankruptcy. They sold everything they had. And the man who actually owned the name, the man who owned the company at this time, he's passed away, and he's given the rights to the films and the trademark to his son, who owns Pacific Theaters in California. And we call and negotiate with him, and he's helpful. He works with John on making soundtracks, but he will not put a dime into anything. Every time John wants to get a piece of film remade, he's got to pay for it himself. And John's not rich. As a technician, he makes a good living traveling around the country. But one of the things I know about John Harvey is that he is so dedicated to making the audiences happy. He would rather not have you even know that he's back there doing all this work. He just wants you to enjoy the show. And he doesn't charge a lot, so he gets calls from a lot of theaters around the country saying, John, come here, John, come there. And he's a bad businessman when it comes to telling somebody no, or that he's going to have to charge them more. He probably works 365 days a year, just everywhere he can, helping people. A lot of times when he's running Cinerama here, his beeper will go off. Somebody in Detroit's got a problem, and he's got to call him and say, as soon as I'm finished playing Cinerama in Dayton, I'll be on the highway, and he will drive to Detroit to work overnight to help them with their problem. What was it? John was talking to the audience yesterday. People were asking about some of the other films he's collected over the years that people have given him pieces of. He has prints of Cinerama Holiday, but it's turned red, and he has a print of Seven Wonders of the World, but it was put on cheap stock, and it has turned red. But the soundtrack's in German. I asked him yesterday, well, how much would it cost if we called Cinerama to ask them to make a copy on magnetic tape of their English language soundtrack? He said $1,200. So guess what we're going to do next year? Play Seven Wonders of the World, red, in 7-channel stereo, because it'll be the best existing copy of that. There'll be no blues, yellows, or greens, and we've got to let people know that. It's not a communist plot. Film stock, certain types of film stock turn red. In fact, I was telling the audience yesterday that half of the movies made since World War II, the original copies of them are now red. What we watch on television is usually a videotape copy that doesn't turn red of one of the earlier films when it was still in full color, sometimes Technicolor. There's a lot of different names for it, but the multicolor process. This is a magazine called Vision. I believe this is what is this? This is like #1. Cinerama Showplace. This is cute. John sent them some film strips to show them how Cinerama worked, and actually put it on the cover of the magazine. These are actual frames from this is Cinerama. When all three of them are put together, you can't even hardly see the seams that join the pictures. If you've seen This is Cinerama, you realize there's no story to it, there are no actors. They show you this incredible process, and it's amazing when you think about it. The first 5 films was pretty much showing you how well it worked. It could have gone on for a long time if it would have been handled better. And this is the star, our hero, John Harvey himself, in his home living room cinema. Yes, John has 2 home living room cinemas. He built the first one in his basement, but there's a problem. You know, in basements you can only go up about 6 or 7 feet. He built a curved screen. I think he made it either out of wooden or metal slats to get the effect of the ribbons, because he didn't even have access to the ribbons. He took 3 Century projectors, converted them so they would play Cinerama film. If the parts didn't exist, he would have them made. Also, he could run 6 minutes, which was all he could find, of How the West Was Won, actually the trailer in true Cinerama. And once that happened, word started getting out through fellow film buffs and projectionists, where they would call him and say, hey, I know where you can find the head of a projector, a sound reproducer, a bit of film. He's collected equipment and film from literally around the world. A gentleman in Australia was one of his first and early leads on some of the film and the equipment. Then he met Willem, who is from Holland in Europe. Willem knew of pieces of equipment and film. They found some in Germany. That's how they got the Seven Wonders of the World print. And from France, he got a Renault car commercial, a little 10-minute Cinerama commercial that they used to show in theaters because they thought so much of Cinerama in Europe. He's gotten pieces of film from Scotland, from England, from Germany. Just a couple of years ago, down in South America, An old theater that had been boarded up for years was opened up, and they found cases and cases of Cinerama films. Unfortunately, the vinegar syndrome had attacked them, and they had shrunk to the point that a lot of the film won't even go through a projector without breaking, and a lot of it had already turned red. They're still inspecting that film, there was so much of it, to see if there's something that's playable, and the gentleman that has the rights to it is charging, John said, 3 times what anybody has asked to sell Cinerama film before. He doesn't have the equipment to play it, but he's got pieces of it that John hopefully someday will get a hold of some of it to preserve it and maintain it. This is a really neat article. I got copies for members of the press. If you've got media back in your hometown that would like to do stories on Cinerama, write to the theater or call us, and we'll send you copies of this article. It's actually 4 different articles appeared in this magazine that talk about the history of Cinerama and John Harvey's work to preserve it and his network of friends who've been supporting it.